Hello, and welcome to Tea Talk with Dawn, a seasonal podcast by Fairy Crane Tea. I am Dawn, and this space is where we explore tea not just as a beverage, but as a cultural bridge between China and the West. One that connects seasonal living, traditional philosophy, and modern life through the quiet practice of tea. In our previous Spring Origins episodes, we reflected on the transition out of winter stillness, on foundation, on awakening energy beneath the surface, and on how tea historically aligned with the earliest seasonal shifts rather than the visible bloom of spring. Those episodes were about beginnings, about roots, about the quiet emergence before growth. And today's episodes move us one step deeper into the season. This is where we begin to explore awakening, not as something dramatic or external, but as something deeply personal and inward. We'll be reflecting on how traditional tea ritual came to be, how it was never originally intended as performance, and why, even though tea ceremony may appear graceful and structured from the outside, it has always been an internal experience of awareness, alignment, and seasonal awakening. So before the music begins, I invite you to simply slow down, take a breath, and arrive fully into this moment. And now, let's begin. Long before tea was aesthetic, before it was photographed, before it was ever seen as a ceremony by observers, tea was seasonal. In early Chinese tea culture, particularly during the Tang Dynasty, tea was not approached as a performance, nor as a luxury ritual. It was a seasonal practice rooted in rhythm, the rhythm of climate, agriculture, and inner cultivation. Spring especially held a quiet significance, not because of flowers, but because of awakening. Historical tea texts describe early spring tea gatherings not as a social spectacle, but as contemplative encounters with the season itself. Scholars, monks, and tea practitioners would prepare tea in near silence, not out of rigidity, but out of respect for the transitional energy of the season. Water was heated slowly. Windows were open to allow the cool spring air to circulate. And the first spring teas, often delicate and freshly harvested, were treated with extraordinary attentiveness, because these teas were believed to carry the first living energy of the year, not metaphorically, but energetically. By the time of the Song Dynasty, tea culture evolved further, becoming more refined, more intentional, and more philosophically layered. Yet, even as techniques became more sophisticated, one principle remained unchanged. Tea was never meant to be performed for others. It was meant to be experienced within. To an outside observer, a tea ritual might appear graceful, structured, and even performative, but internally it functioned as a meditative alignment with nature's cycles. The slow pouring, the attention to temperature, the stillness between movements. Each action was less about display and more about awareness. This is an important cultural distinction that is often misunderstood today. Modern interpretations sometimes view tea ceremony as an art form of presentation, but historically the ritual was not created for an audience. It was created for inner regulation, especially in spring, when the world begins to move again and the mind must learn to awaken without becoming restless. In traditional season philosophy, spring is governed by rising energy, upward, expansive, and alive. After the stillness of winter, the body and spirit do not abruptly transform, they stir. Tea practitioners historically observed this shift not through theory, but through lived ritual. The first cups of spring tea were often lighter, more aromatic, and intentionally brewed with shorter infusions, not to extract more flavor, but to preserve delicacy. Because early spring energy is not strong, it is sensitive. There is also a deeply personal dimension to this practice. While tea gatherings did exist socially, the core experience of tea ritual was always inward. A practitioner might sit with tea alone at dawn, listening to the kettle, watching steam dissolve into the air, noticing how the aroma changed with each steep. This was not indulgence, this was cultivation of perception. In Taoist influenced tea philosophy, awakenings begin with noticing subtle change, and spring is the season of subtle change. Even the selection of teaware historically reflected this inward orientation. In spring, lighter vessels were often preferred. Porcelain, pale glazes, or simple ceramics to mirror the brightness of the season. Not ornate, not distracting, but quietly supportive of awareness. Because when the external environment is simplified, internal awareness becomes clearer. And this is why tea ritual, though visibly beautiful, was never intended to impress. Its beauty was a byproduct of presence. To the outside, tea ritual can look structured, measured, intentional in movement, but internally it's fluid. There is no performance inside the experience, only observation. Observation of the breath, observation of the senses, observation of the subtle shift from winter heaviness into spring lightness. As tea culture spread globally, visual elements of ritual became more visible than the philosophical core. Graceful pouring, elegant tools, minimalist settings, and from the outside, it can resemble performance. But historically, this interpretation would have felt incomplete to traditional practitioners because the true ceremony was never external. It was internal alignment with the season, with the breath, and presence. In early spring, especially, tea was used as a way to regulate emotional awakening. Winter often encouraged introspection and stillness. Spring introduces movement, creativity, and mental expansion. Without grounding, this shift can feel overwhelming. Tea ritual provided a bridge between stillness and motion, a controlled, quiet awakening, not forced energy, but guided emergence. Imagine sitting with tea at the first signs of spring appear outside. No audience, no expectation, no performance, only the sound of water, the warmth of the cup, the gentle unfolding of the leaves. This is where awakening actually occurs, not in visible gestures, but in eternal awareness. Now bring this understanding into your own experience. Where in your life might you be mistaking visibility for growth, activity for awakening, and momentum for alignment? Spring invites movement, yes, but tea culture reminds us that the most meaningful awakening is often quiet and deeply personal. As you prepare or imagine your next cup of tea, pause before the first sip. Notice the temperature, the aroma, the stillness of the moment. Ask gently, what within me is awakening slowly this season? What is emerging, not dramatically, but naturally? This question itself is part of the ritual. This podcast serves as a cultural and philosophical introduction to the seasonal tea journey we explore more deeply in our tea and culture classes. Here, we reflect on the history, symbolism, and inward meaning of tea ritual. Within the classes, we move beyond reflection into guided practice, learning seasonal tea selection, cultural context, and the lived experience of tea as a bridge between Chinese tradition and modern life. The podcast is the awareness. The classes are the embodiment. And in our next episode, we will move further inward from cultural understanding into the felt experience of awakening itself, exploring how tea ritual becomes not just a seasonal practice, but a meditative space for personal transformation. Because true awakening is not something we display. It is something we experience quietly, cup by cup, breath by breath, season by season. As we come to the end of today's episode, I invite you to sit with one quiet reflection. Tea ritual throughout history was never created to be observed. It was never meant to be a performance. What may appear graceful or ceremonial from the outside has always been, at its core, a deeply personal experience, an inward awakening shaped by season, presence, and intention. Spring, especially in its earliest phase, does not ask us to bloom all at once. It asks us to stir gently, to notice subtle change, to awaken slowly rather than suddenly. And tea offers us a space to meet that awakening with quiet awareness, not through urgency, not through display, but through stillness, warmth, and attention to the present moment. Perhaps the next time you prepare tea, you pause just a little longer before the first sip. You notice the aroma, the warmth of the cup in your hands, the unfolding of the leaves. And in that small moment, you allow yourself to awaken with the season rather than rush ahead of it. If you would like to continue the seasonal journey beyond the podcast, you can find us across our visual and educational spaces where we share tea, culture, and seasonal reflections throughout the week. On Instagram, we are at Fairy Crane Chaw, CHA, Fairy Crane Chaw. On YouTube, Patreon, and Pinterest, we are at Fairy Crane Tea. With YouTube, we are at Fairy Crane Tea. Each space offers a different expression of the same philosophy. Tea as a bridge between tradition, culture, and modern mindful living. Until our next episode, may your tea be warm, your mind be present, and your awakening unfold gently with the rhythm of the season. This is Dawn with Fairy Crane Tea, and this has been Tea Talk with Dawn.